Hello, dear friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching us. Have a good rest of your day. I'm Daniel Kamrov. Welcome to my podcast on YouTube. We continue our meetings with the outstanding religious leaders, scientists under the rubric of keeping the faith. In my interviews with rabbis, a Roman Catholic archbishop, imam, and historians, links to which you can find in the first comment under the video, I asked well-known experts about the possibility and desire of representatives of different religions to build interfaith dialogue with each other. What is even more important is to define the mission, vision, and values of this dialogue. What result each side would like to achieve. I'm grateful for the unique opportunity to meet with the outstanding religious leader who has created a space where representatives of different religions conduct their dialogue with the Creator, build their communities, and interfaith peace around one roof. Such a temple is located in Tbilisi, Georgia. Today, we meet with Archbishop Malkhaz Songulashvili. Bishop Malkhaz is a Metropolitan Bishop of Evangelical Baptist Church in Tbilisi. He's a professor of comparative theology at Ilia State University. Bishop Malkhaz is a prominent interfaith bridge builder, a senior pastor of the Peace Cathedral with a Peace Mosque and a Peace Synagogue in Tbilisi. Dear Bishop Malkhaz, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed and to share your perspective and wisdom.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm delighted to be a part of your podcast.
Thank you so much. So, let me start by asking you about your childhood. You were born in the Soviet Union, where there was officially one nationality, Soviet man, one religion, atheism, with its Holy Trinity, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. Any other religion was declared a drug, opium for the people, which was fought with all possible means. At the same time, you were born into a religious family. Your father was a Baptist minister, and that means that since your childhood you have become a dissenter. According to the authorities, you were in a poisonous atmosphere of religious prejudice, and therefore they wanted to take you away from your family. Could you please tell us how it happened that you stayed in the family and preserved your religious views?
Well, it is true. I was born in the country where irreligion was a religion. I was born 10 years after Stalin's death in 1963 into the Baptist family. My father was a Baptist minister. My mother was a sacristan of the church and a very committed choir member. She was a lovely singer. By virtue of my family's religious identity, we were considered dissidents in an era when the state was determined to eradicate religion. That was early 60s. This was during the time of Nikita Khrushchev. When I was born, obviously I can't remember it, but I've been told, when I was born, the authorities intended to remove me from my family and place me in an orphanage, fearing that I would be infected with a religious worldview. My father had to use all his connections in Georgia to prevent the state from taking me away. I was the youngest of 4 children, 2 brothers and 1 sister. I was especially close to my grandmother. Melania was her name, an exceptional character. She was a fascinating storyteller and a self-taught expert in the Bible. I grew up immersed in the biblical stories of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Jacob, Esau and Joseph and his brothers, Jesus and his disciples. These were the tales, narratives my grandmother passed down to me. My mother, Natella, shared Georgian folklore tales and traditional fairy stories. Meanwhile, my sister, who was 8 years older, Zia was her name, who was trained to become a librarian, read classical literature to me long before I learned how to read or write. For a time, I genuinely believed that all these biblical, folkloric, and literary characters coexisted in a single universe. And I even imagined that Joseph might meet sometime little Red Riding Hood somewhere and somehow. I owe my religious convictions entirely to my family. When my mother became pregnant with me, she initially did not want another child. She was frail and she was tired after having raised three children. But my father persuaded her to keep me and dedicated me to God, as it were. From an early age, I knew that I was in some sense consecrated. My grandmother ensured I had a strong grasp of biblical narratives and biblical knowledge. And my father and parents, my mother, cared beautifully after me. When I began school, I quickly realized that I was a maverick and a dissenter among my classmates. Since then, I was coming from a religious family. Since then, I have never felt part of the mainstream. I have always been and will always remain a dissident. And that is how I'm going to die.
Well, that is a very interesting story how one can be brought up in a religious family where in the country that seems to be the whole country seems to be against religion and how that
Absolutely.
so how did it happen that while remaining a religious person you managed to enter and graduate from Tbilisi State University, becoming a master's in history and pedagogy?
Well, I was in my final year of secondary school when I began contemplating what I should do with my education and with my life. I was 17 years old. At the feast of the baptism of Jesus, by chance, I ran into the minister of my church. His name was Gogi Bolgashvili, a fascinating character. He asked me how much longer I plan to delay my baptism. In our tradition, which is Baptist, it is not the parents but the individual who makes a conscious decision to be baptized and follow the faith. That is the reason why our tradition is called Baptist. I realize that if I were baptized and formally joined the church, I might not be allowed to enter university. At the time, only members of the Communist Youth League, the so-called Komsomol, were eligible to study at university. Admission at the university required a recommendation letter from the organization, Communist Youth League, which I could not obtain as I had refused to join the organization due to my dissident views. I was in mental agony, as it were, forced to choose between my faith, between religion, and the university education. After much inner turmoil, I made my decision. At 5 a.m. in the early morning, I knocked on my father's bedroom door and told my father to baptize me immediately before I changed my mind. He and my mother took me to the Rev'd, and there, near the monastery of Shir, in the freezing cold water, my father baptized me. It was January 19th. Afterwards, I graduated from school and applied to the university to study history and archaeology, a faculty considered ideologically sensitive. Naturally, I had no recommendation from the Komsomol. Nevertheless, I passed four entrance exams and scored 22 credits, exceeding the 18 credits required for admission. So I was accepted into the university, the first university to be established in the country in 1918. After successfully completing 2 semesters, it was discovered that I was not a member of the Youth Communist League. That was when the pressure began. I faced continuous efforts to coerce me into joining. Different individuals, students, and others were enlisted to apply pressure on me. I stood firm and managed to refuse. Eventually, the leader of the Communist Youth League offered me a deal. They would stop harassing me on the condition that I would not publicly reveal that I was not a Komsomol member. I agreed and then continued my studies and successfully completed my university studies. By the time I graduated, Perestroika, which was reform movement initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev, had taken place, and I was invited to remain at the university as a junior lecturer in medieval history, and I taught Old Testament, Biblical Hebrew, early church history. This is how I ended up in the academic world.
That's honestly a horrible story that universities in the country didn't allow or try to stop people who weren't a part of the Komsomol to learn and to study. And as you already mentioned, when you were a young scholar, a rabbi taught you Hebrew. Tell us
Yes.
about this teacher. Did communication with him help you develop principles of interaction with the other?
Right. That's a brilliant question. Thank you for asking this. When I was studying at the university, I decided to deepen my understanding of the Bible by learning Bible's original languages, Greek and Hebrew. Greek was readily available through official university courses, so I enrolled in those. However, Biblical Hebrew in the Soviet Union was prohibited and only taught unofficially in secret. Through a friend of mine, I managed to obtain a copy of Shlomo Kodesh's Handbook of Hebrew, published in Tel Aviv, smuggled in from Kiev. Unfortunately, the handbook was a photocopy of a photocopy. The letters were so faint and blurred, they were hardly legible. I remember the struggle to distinguish between Gimel and Nun, as both appeared almost identical in the poor reproduction of my handbook, Shlomo Kodesh. A professor at the university, he was a great scholar, Zurab Gignaze was his name, learned about my efforts to study Hebrew and introduced me to a friend of his at the Institute of Oriental Studies. This man came from a very prominent rabbinical family, Sephardi, not Sephardi, but Georgian Jewish rabbinical family, and was both a brilliant Hebrew scholar and respected academic. His name was Nissan Babalikashvili. His dissertation was on Hebrew inscriptions from Crimea. He taught me Hebrew using Moshe Greenberg's Biblical Hebrew. That was a book, which though also a copy of a copy, but it was better condition than the previous handbook. Sadly, I was one of Nissan's final students. He passed away from lung cancer at the age of 48, very young man. I had no idea he was ill, so his death came as a profound shock. I attended his funeral in the old part of the city, held at the synagogue. It was a deeply traumatic experience for me. What remains vivid in my memory is a funeral procession. I can still remember his coffin, followed by his mother, his sisters, and mother was weeping and wailing loudly over the loss of her son. I also wept, but I wept silently. On my way home, riding a trolley bus through the grey streets of the city, I had a profound spiritual realization. My exclusivist Christian theology collapsed in that moment. I could no longer believe in a God who would not embrace those who were not Christian. That was when I realized that others belong to me and I belong to others. That
That
trolleybus journey, I should say, marked the beginning of my interfaith path, one that began quietly that day after the funeral of my teacher, my rabbi, and has not ended yet.
Thank you for sharing that story, and it is, I guess, a good ending to a rather sad story, and it's a good way of um, growth in, I guess, in tragedy is to find a way to grow spiritually. So, moving on to a more uh, happier note, I'd like to start a question with a joke.
Okay? I like jokes.
Thank you. Uh, Old Rabbi Cohen retires, and the new young rabbi is employed by the community. On his first Shabbat in his new post, they are about to start reading from the Torah when a huge heated argument breaks out over whether you should stand or sit during the reading of the Ten Commandments. The following day, the traumatized young rabbi goes to visit his predecessor and asks him, Rabbi Cohen, I need your advice. What is the custom of our community when we read the Ten Commandments? Rabbi Cohen replies, Well, why do you ask? Well, because yesterday, when we read from the Torah portion containing that important section, the half of the community sat, while the half of the community stood, and the ones who were sitting were yelling and screaming at the ones who were standing, and the ones who were standing were yelling and screaming at the ones who were sitting. Ah, replied Rabbi Cohen, now that is our custom.
Oh, that
And
is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant.
thank
And
you so much.
it could be applicable to many, many different congregations as well.
Yes, of course. In that story, that we see that the custom appeared in the community that was not even understood by the rabbi. I'd like to ask about the relationship between immutable truth in religion and innovations in new customs. For
Mm.
example, quotations from canonical books of different religions can be used to justify conflicts, hate speech, or even bloody wars. or
Indeed.
one can find or emphasize something that would promote peace between representatives of different religions and people. What do you think about this?
Well, question is, what is immutable truth? Every religion, in my view, is intended to liberate its adherents from egocentrism, tribalism, and a lack of empathy. And I think for me, this is immutable truth. Sacred texts are, of course, profoundly important, but they must be read within the context in which they were written and with an understanding of the circumstances they were meant to address. I think something that is immensely important to realize, we are called to worship God and to interpret the sacred scriptures we have received, we have inherited in our respective traditions, and not the other way around. Judaism has perhaps the most brilliant tradition to encourage generations of rabbis after the destruction of the temple to interpret the text over and over again. And I also believe in that it is our responsibility to be serious about reading sacred text. It is our responsibility to interpret these texts in ways that allow them to speak meaningfully to our own time and age. Religion is meant to help all of us, not to hurt us. And time again, we see some serious and very sad developments when religion or God, name of God, is used to subdue people, humiliate, abuse, kill. And time has come when we need to stop it. We need to develop different ways of being religious, not hurting and not harming anyone.
Thank you so much for that answer. And that is truly important for representatives of different religions, that indeed religion should not be a explanation for hurting others rather than trying to build peace between different people.
Absolutely.
Thank you. According
I
to the
can't agree more.
Thank you so much. Yes, and it's truly horrible that many people, many religious people, find that an opportunity, religion and sacred texts, an opportunity to justify wars and violence.
That is embarrassing. And I, well, not only wars and violence. Whenever I meet people of different religion, Jews or Yazidis or Muslims and others, I somehow feel to start my deliberations, whatever I'm going to deliver, speeches or sermons or whatever, by saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that in the name of my religion, in the name of my God, your predecessors, your religion has been hurt. I'm very sorry what has been done in the name of Christianity to our Jewish brothers and sisters. What is being done to our Muslim brothers and sisters. It is not acceptable to use this most sacred name of God to violate human rights and abuse people.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, I think that it is really important that we deliver that, well, people deliver that message and say that their religion is not about violence and is not about trying to hurt others. And so people would learn and understand that not in that a few, a radical few that try to make it a violent religion is not the whole religion itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
According to the Bible, the first man, Adam, and his wife Hawa, were created on the sixth day. God blessed them. Judaism and Islam are against celibacy. In various Christian communities, clergy cannot have families, for example, Catholic priests. You're a bishop of the Church of Evangelical Christian Baptists. What role does family play in your life? Does it help you or hinder you in carrying out your ministry?
Thank you, Daniel. This is very interesting question, to say the least. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic on celibacy, particularly within the context of various religious traditions. I am fully aware that in Judaism, as well as in many other traditions, celibacy is not typically regarded as a viable or preferred option. Christianity, however, offers a distinctive perspective on that matter. In its early history, celibacy was often viewed as the highest expression of spiritual devotion, particularly among those dedicating their lives to monastic communities and contemplative pursuits in Egypt, in Syria, in different parts of the world. The emphasis on celibacy does not suggest that Christianity devalues family life. On the contrary, early Christian communities saw themselves as extended families, referring to one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. And in some communities, you may still hear this vocabulary being used. The leaders of these communities were affectionately called fathers and mothers, reflecting the nurturing and pastoral roles they played in the life of their congregations. In the Roman Catholic Church, the papal title, Pope, literally means father, highlighting the central role of familial relationships within the religious group. Well, I think here I need to go a little bit personal. I began my life, my ministry, as a celibate, having joined an ecumenical Franciscan order known as tertiaries. As a part of this commitment, we would renew our vows annually on the feast day of St. Francis, the 4th October. Each year, I reaffirmed my vows, including the promise of celibacy. At the time, I was serving as Archbishop of the Church and also as rector of a theological seminary. My responsibilities also including transformative interfaith work with refugees from Chechnya. On one of the occasions, the Imam of the Chechen refugee community asked me why I had chosen not to marry. I explained that within our tradition, it is seen as a virtue to dedicate one's life holy to God and the church. His name was, the Imam's name was Abdullah Ahmedov. He responded firmly, "This is wrong. You should have a wife." I replied, somewhat defiantly, that it is never going to happen. Perhaps you should never say never. He smiled and said, "I will pray, brother, that Allah grants you a wife." In time, I began to reconsider my commitment to celibacy when I fell in love with a remarkable woman named Allah. Also, this is not Allah, spelled with one L and no H. We married, and in doing so, I embraced a different way of life. Previously, I had structured my life as a celibate man, and now I had to restructure my life. I do not claim that this was new path. I'm not claiming. I do not claim that this new path is better or worse than the former. It is simply different. Celibacy, I still believe, is indeed a gift, but it is not a calling for everyone, nor should it be imposed on anybody. If priests and others who have taken vows of celibacy later feel called to marry, they should be free to do so. Religious life should never be about compulsion, especially when there is no explicit command of or encouragement in the teaching that requires celibate life. Having a family at times both help and hinder one's ministry. However, the primary blessing of family life is that it keeps one grounded and humble, rooted in the reality of everyday life.
Thank you so much for a beautiful and a very unbiased answer with a very interesting arguments and allowing there to be place for everyone's point of view.
Absolutely. I strongly believe in that, Daniel.
Thank you so much for that answer. You highly respected by representatives of many faiths, not only in Georgia, but also in other countries. And you have spoken with at various Muslim meetings on more than one occasion. And you have been received with great respect there. For example, you attended the largest Muslim convention, Jalsa Salana, in the UK in 2018. Why did you pray the Islamic ritual prayer, namaz, and what message do you bring to this religion?
This is yet another brilliant question, Daniel. Thank you for it. First of all, I have spoken not only at Muslim gatherings, but also at Jewish, Hindu, Baha'i, Yazidi, and even Christian meetings and conventions. I have also prayed in many sacred spaces belonging to a wide variety of religious traditions. For me, to be absolutely honest, prayer is always both sacramental and political. By political, I do not mean party politics, but rather the politics of God and God's children. I have paid homage at Yazidi temple in Lalish in Iraq, at the Kotel, Western Wall in Jerusalem, and in Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, in solidarity with our siblings from other faith traditions. Among many other things, prayer is a powerful tool for peace building. I strongly believe in it. For that reason, I never hesitate to offer my modest contribution to fostering peace and dialogue between religions and cultures. I am humbled to be welcomed by my interfaith brothers and sisters into their shrines, temples, synagogues, mosques for prayer. And I am equally glad to welcome them into my own sacred spaces at the Peace Cathedral. While working on my doctoral dissertation in Oxford, UK, I was invited by the imam of a local mosque to deliver the khutbah, Friday sermon. It was a challenge for me. It was first time I was suggested, I was invited to preach in a Muslim sacred space. Luckily, I was given 2 months' notice, during which I carefully prepared for the occasion. As a part of the preparation, I memorized required prayers in Arabic and Quranic verses to be used during the service and during the sermon. Since then, I have been able to pray namaz comfortably whenever the opportunity arises. For me, it is expression of solidarity with people, with my siblings in Muslim tradition.
Certainly. Thank you so much for an interesting story and for an opportunity to hear how people of different faiths eventually meet and pray together. You mentioned the Peace Cathedral. That is a special place in Tbilisi where representatives of different religions, Christian, Muslims, and Jews, pray under one roof, where the sounds of Muslim prayers, Sabbath services, and Georgian hymns fill the air as believers of different faiths mingle and break bread in the common hall of Abraham. Could you tell me more about the history and the presence of this project?
What I refer to, in fact, is our peace project at the Peace Cathedral. To make a long story short, our main church in Tbilisi, known as the Peace Cathedral, has stood there for over 150 years. Throughout its history, there has scarcely been a time when the church was not either actively persecuted or subtly, quietly suppressed and marginalized. In response to this ongoing adversity, the church developed what we call a theology of beauty, a way of surviving through grace, creativity, and most importantly, resilience. In practical terms, this theology of beauty, means that whenever the church is confronted with ugliness, whether it is social, political, spiritual, religious, it responds with an act of beauty. This could take the form of a social initiative, an artistic creation, a material project, or an intellectual offering. Recently, we witnessed a troubling rise of Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, and anti-Semitism in Georgia, often fueled by political actors. The Peace Cathedral responded swiftly and decisively, launching several initiatives to counter this wave of hatred and irrational fear of Jews and Muslims and people of different race and people of different gender or sexual orientation. Two of the most significant were the bold and symbolic decisions to construct a mosque and a synagogue under the roof of the church itself, as a direct response to the ugliness of intolerance, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. Given that our church has never had independent financial resources, we always relied entirely on fundraising for these and other projects. To ensure that the initiative became a true exercise in interfaith solidarity, we introduced the principle: Muslims were not permitted to donate to the construction of the mosque. They could only contribute to the building of the synagogue. Likewise, Jewish donors could not support the synagogue. They were invited to help fund the mosque instead. Naturally, this slowed down the fundraising process, but it also turned the initiative into a profound educational experience. Religious communities were asked to contribute to the creation of sacred spaces other than their own, a radical act of trust and mutual respect. Believe it or not, we now have a fully functioning mosque and a synagogue within the Peace Cathedral, under the roof of the Peace Cathedral. Over time, 2 additional sacred spaces have been added: a Buddhist Peace Temple, very small oratory, and a chapel of reconciliation, designated for people of any faith or none at all. Today we can say with joy and humility that there exists a place on the earth in Tbilisi, Georgia, where under one roof you'll find a church, mosque, synagogue, Buddhist shrine, and a universal oratory, all sharing the same address. Entered through a single door. This is our response to division, hatred, fear, irrational fear. This is the space of shared beauty, where peace is not just practiced, but lived, experienced, enjoyed.
That is a beautiful story. And you mentioned already that you enter through one door, but I've heard a story about the doors of the Peace Mosque and the Peace Synagogue, that they used to be in another house. Could you please tell us the story of these doors, one of which leads to the room where Muslims pray and the other where Jews turn to God?
On one of my many journeys to the Middle East, I met a Muslim cleric from a distinguished scholarly family. He was genuinely excited to learn about the peace project and expressed a strong desire to contribute to the construction of the mosque. I explained, however, that under the guiding principle of the initiative, Muslims were not permitted to fund the mosque. They were permitted to fund the synagogue. He paused for a moment and then offered a brilliant idea. What if, he said, I give you two old doors from my grandparents' home? You could give one door to the synagogue and the other to the mosque. Immediately, he invited me to visit a very old house where these doors had been kept for decades. They were at least 200 years old. Though weathered and in rather poor condition, I was really attracted by the idea to bring them to Georgia. I gratefully accepted the offer, and we arranged to bring the doors back to Georgia. Our architect then spent 2 painstaking months restoring them, repairing the decayed wooden frames, preserving the intricate carvings, and renewing the rusted iron decorations. In the end, the result was nothing short of extraordinary. 2 beautifully restored doors that are quite possibly the oldest artifacts now housed within the Peace Cathedral. More importantly, they have become powerful symbol of interfaith cooperation, generosity, and shared heritage. One door now stands in the Peace Synagogue, and its twin door in the Peace Mosque. To this day, I feel a deep sense of pride whenever I see them. These doors, silent, dignified witnesses to what is possible when faith traditions reach across divisions to honor one another with beauty and respect.
Definitely, and I think that is a great project and a great symbol, and a great reminder for, excuse me, for all, not only Jews and Muslims, but for everyone that attends the Peace Cathedral, uh, that we are, in a way, well, we are united and we are all different ways to God, so we should take pride in that. I have
Well,
heard
I'm grateful for your comments. I honestly believe, Daniel, that future belongs to the partnership, genuine partnership and cooperation.
certainly, and I agree, and that is why, in fact, one of the reasons why I decided to start this project. I
I'm
heard
very,
this.
very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. I heard this story from a leader of a Jewish community. She said that her grandfather lived in a town in Belarus where more than half of the residents were Jews and were also Catholics, Orthodox, and Tatar Muslims. Her grandfather was a builder, and he built a mosque in his town for the local Tatars. Maybe this is the way of interfaith peace, helping each other build temples.
Well, I do agree. Perhaps it is just one of many possible paths forward. The most important thing is to keep respectful, and honest dialogue alive, but not dialogue for its own sake. Rather, a dialogue rooted in openness of heart and mind. A dialogue in which we are willing to be changed, enriched, inspired, and affirmed through our encounter with others. That to me is the essence and the purpose of interfaith dialogue. Without these depths of engagement, without a genuine willingness to listen and grow, interfaith dialogue loses its meaning. It must be more than a polite exchange of ideas. It must be a transformative journey, both personal and communal.
Thank you so much, and I agree, and I think that one of the most important things that interfaith dialogue should bring is an open discussion to the table. And for my final question, I'd like to ask one of already a traditional questions on the channel, and that is, if you had the opportunity to ask God directly one question, what would that question be?
But I believe, as a man of faith, I have the opportunity to ask God a question at any time through prayer and contemplation. And if I were to ask just one, it would be simple. Why? That single word for me carries the weight of a sorrow and joy, injustice and grace, suffering and beauty. It is a cry of human heart, reaching towards the mystery of the divine, and I believe I would not need to say more, for God would already know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is a very deep question, and I believe that every one of the religious people who are constantly talking to God through prayer or just believe in God want to ask that same question.
Well,
Dear Bishop,
this is for me, it's a legitimate question to ask,
of course, of
and
course,
we don't need to be shy of asking this question.
of course. And I think it is one of the most important questions. Dear Bishop Malkhaz, thank you for the great opportunity to learn from you.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast, and I wish all the best to you and to all the people who will be listening this broadcast.
Thank you so much. Dear friends, thank you for watching my channel. Please react to the podcast, like, repost. All reactions are very welcome. See you soon on the podcast, Keeping the Faith.